Welcome everyone to Fog Tuesday. As far as I know, there might be an alien invasion in the neighborhood next over mine. I wouldn't know anyways, because I can't see more than 3 steps out of my window. Now, for today, on the eve of yet another reset in patch 10.2.5, we are at the usual time of the week where we are recapping the situation when it comes to Mythic Plus. Now, there is a shiny extra thing to look at for today. Because while we can keep going over and monitoring the results of all of the buffed spec from the last balance tuning that happened at this point over a couple of weeks ago, there is also an extra thing that might impact the current situation in Mythic Plus, which is the beginning of the time trials for the MDI. Now, the time trials at this moment are limited to just a couple of dungeons, Everbloom and Rise. Now, what is special about this tournament so far is the fact that at the moment, the results are showing us something interesting. Besides the fun part of noticing very good players can clear an Everbloom plus 23 keys in 10 minutes, that's pretty cool, right? However, the other thing that they show us is that, first of all, you don't even need a healer at this point. If you're good enough in these type of keys, you can just run with quadruple DPS, even more so if one of them is an augmentation evoker to help with the tankiness. The other thing that has been seeping through is that both of these dungeons for the multiple teams participating have found more or less the same composition, which includes one you might already be aware about, which is a mage, right? The fire mage, after the buffs, is now a staple in most Mythic Plus groups for high-level keys and competitive levels. However, the extras are the warlock and the priest. Not just the priest as a shadow priest, but also the warlock as a destruction warlock. So not even demo. Those are the 2 extra additions to the popular comps in Mythic Plus when it comes to this thing right here. When it comes to pushing, so to speak, lower level keys. That's because, of course, the goal of this tournament is to basically try to pull the entire dungeon in as few pools as you can. You can basically do the entirety of the Everbloom in like 6 pools, unironically. This means your DPS players will have to fight something like 20 or even 30 mobs at once. So, at that point, what becomes the strongest tool for a DPS is to have as much of an uncapped AoE as possible. That is where the growth, the presence of Destruction and Shadow Priest come into play. They are amongst the specs that can do better without limits when it comes to AoE, as opposed to other specs which are not being included amongst these groups for the MDI. Now, obviously, there is a big difference between pushing very high-level keys where you don't get to pull that many mobs compared to those tournament keys. However, you can still see the growth of these 2 specs over time, even amongst commoners, even amongst normal level keys. You can even see the difference from the average key level to the top maximum DPS. You can see they are actually the 2 highest together with fire and demo. You can even see it here, the difference between the average and the top damage. You can see the top damage of Shadow Priest and Destruction is actually much more comparable, not to their neighbors in the rankings, but actually to the top. Actually, they are both comfortably above the average top damage of a Red Paladin, because Red Paladin, of course, also doesn't have nearly as much of an uncapped AoE potential as these 2 specs. It is a good experiment, a good social experiment, especially after we had a few days ago, a video about what is the meta and how is it shaped, pointing out how the meta is a trickle-down effect that comes from the top players and then trickles lower down to all different levels of play in the game. It is cool to see that the choices made in a tournament played by basically like 70 people is impacting even in the average ratings of the old keys, all top keys in Mythic Plus, the higher presence and the overall higher damage of these 2 specs right now in Mythic Plus. It is also true that over time these 2 specs have been buffed. If we go all the way back to the start of the actual season, right? The Destruction and Shadow were not having a good time compared to where they are now. They have grown, of course, over time after the buffs also of a few weeks ago, to the point where now they also are doing much better. Together with the rest of the gang of the specs we mentioned being buffed, like Windwalker, over time, Survival has been buffed a couple of weeks ago, together with Arms Warrior as well, was another beneficiary of the buffs. Red Paladin received the buffs as well. Other specs did not get nearly as much luck even after being buffed, like Unholy, Frost Decay, Feral Druid. Those were also buffed specs who are not actually doing nearly as much, together with Affliction Warlock as well. But in the case of Shadow, in the case of Destruction, we have seen the growth in their damage, even more so perhaps helped by their presence in the MDI tournament right now. Changing rating system, changing ranking system shows very similar things. This is the Archon rating side from Warcraft Logs. You can see the average score completed of different specs, and you can of course also see very different results based on your specs, together with the rise of both Shadow Priest and Destruction Warlock. This is for all keys above level 25, so we are still at a pretty serious level right now for this week, and this was last week, where before the beginning of the MDI, Destruction wasn't nearly as high compared to this last week. Changing a different ranking site shows us some more or less similar thing in terms of rises of performances of multiple specs. We continue to have multiple of the buffed specs improving over time, with the exception of the usual few ones that did not really get the memo that they have been buffed, like Affliction, really continuing to be very lower down in results. It's a bit sad still, pointing out the state of the healers, unfortunately for the buffed ones, this having to do with the DPS. It's cool to see that the buffed specs now, Holy and Shaman, have increased their damage. Now, as we mentioned last time, there was going to be a new worst spec in terms of DPS, and no surprise, it's here. It's Holy Paladin, with the lowest DPS right now amongst all specs. We can change the site, change the results, the feed of results, and indeed Holy Paladin is also still here, the worst in terms of damage done in Mythic Plus, but at the very least it's not as relevant for all healers. Many healers who, for example, raid only, for example, don't give nearly as much of a focus on the amount of damage a healer can do in the raid compared to Mythic Plus. Having a better look at the evolution of the meta this week, in this season, we have continued to see the rising of some of the specs that were buffed, like Ret being of course the most notable one week after week. We thought this might have been a fluke. This might have been some weird choice of an incorporeal week perhaps, or something, or maybe the weird choice of Prot Paladin losing a lot of value and you still wanting a Paladin in your group. Not really. This week it has confirmed itself again as the second most popular of the DPS options, losing only to Fire Mage. The other thing we wondered if it might have been a fluke or a temporary thing is Augmentation. We have pointed out the week before that it was their worst results ever since the introduction of Augmentation in Dragonflight. We are more or less continuing the same level of presence, the reduced level of presence of Augmentation this season as well. Talking about the other buffed specs, the other one, of course, more visible is Shadow. They lost 1% this week, sure, but now it's, of course, a much bigger improvement compared to the state prior to a couple of weeks ago. Same goes for the healers, where Holy Priest is at 5%, Resto Shaman is at 8%, right? It's a decent increase. The only thing this highlights, however, is the growth of Mistweaver, because with Holy Priest rising, it's Discipline who loses more presence, of course, and Resto Druid also has lost a bunch of their presence over time to Resto Shaman, the one who hasn't really reduced its presence over time. If anything, it has only continued to slowly increase, is Mistweaver right in the bang middle. Yes, the split is still very healthy between the healers. As we mentioned basically every week, the healing role is the one with the most health in terms of variety of options in Mythic Plus right now. You can go and see the overall timeline of the results of the DPS. This is, it helps see the state of certain specs over time, like, of course, the Shadow Priest one we mentioned being buffed. You can see they have been essentially hanging in the bottom 3 to bottom 4 for a while, and then they started being buffed, and all of a sudden they have made a massive spike compared to the other DPS. This as far as range DPS are concerned. For the case of the melee DPS, well, we have another similar thing when it comes to Red Paladin. more or less average middling for most of the expansion, and then they received 2 back-to-back buffs, one and then the second one, and now they have stabilized themselves towards the top of the results in Mythic Plus. You also have the buffs to Windwalker. As you can see, Windwalker was actually even towards the bottom at the very start of this season, and then they decided they were not going to be in the bottom anymore, and they are now one of the better performers in Mythic Plus. A bit of sadness, if we have to be honest, for the state of Assassination, which started the season amongst the better ones. Even while being wildly less played than Outlaw, for some reason they took the brunt of the hate of the rogues. They got nerfed for some reason, and they have continued to just underperform over time ever since then, which I find a little bit unfair, because definitely of the 3 specs of Rogue, Assassination was perhaps the least deserving of a nerf. For tanks and healers, the results are of course a bit less relevant, because this is related to their DPS. So this only shows us that Brewmaster was the top damage, and then over time they have been outdone by Vengeance. This is also expected, because the tank that can do the highest keys is also often the one that will end up having the most damage, simply because of how much more time you will spend in AoE pools, how much more health enemies will have, racking up your overall DPS, whereas a Brewmaster Monk will not have nearly the same chances of a Vengeance Demon Hunter. So it's not that unsurprising that this is the current situation of both of the specs, without nerfs, without damage nerfs. If anything, Brewmaster has not been nerfed, Vengeance has been, and yet the results are still wildly in favor of Vengeance right now. The last one is the healers, which did receive some buffs here and there in terms of damage. The only one thing that didn't change was the superiority of Discipline Priest. The one surprising bit, perhaps, was the DPS of Evoker, Preservation Evoker, which actually remained very competitive, apparently, for almost 2 months of this season, before getting to go back down the average of the rest of the healing specs. The only other thing that was also consistent with the season was Holy Paladin. After the multiple nerfs received for their sins during Exodia, their damage has been completely destroyed compared to what it was back in Season 2. So we can still see some continuous trends after the buffs of the specs, with the most sticking in the meta definitely is Ret. We have to keep the eyes on the current situation when it comes to Shadow Priest and Destruction Warlock for the time being, even possibly Survival Hunter, although as you can see here from the number of runs, there is of course the outlier of Survival still being not very popular, right? It's always funny to see Augmentation being super popular. You even have something like Elemental Shaman being run nearly twice as much as Survival, even though the number of Survival are currently quite healthy, quite nice as a DPS spec in Mythic Plus. Now, the last question we have to make ourselves is the state of the dungeons, not just the state of the specs, because what also happened when these specs were buffed was also that Murzon's Rise, the at the time hardest dungeon in this season, was also nerfed. Now, this is still okay. Yes, Murzon's Rise, even after the nerfs, continues to be the hardest dungeon in Mythic Plus. However, if we go back to a simpler time, perhaps also a harder time, the gap towards the bottom of Murzon's Rise sitting at 73%, or the week before that, where Murzon's Rise was chilling at 67%, or even recently, or even more recently, where it was at 73, again, now it's at 80%. So it's more healthy, it's much closer to the second worst, it's much more in line with the curve of the difficulty of the dungeon. So it's at the very least better than it was before, right? That we can give the dungeon at the very least that. As for the actual players inside of the dungeons, this is this week's popularity of specs in Mythic Plus. We continue to have our, at this point, sadly, for all of the Fire Mage haters such as myself, Fire Mage as now the de facto staple pick. This has now been a staple for multiple weeks that we can confirm basically being a thing, Fire Mage being the new de facto main choice of Mythic Plus. The one that we can see changing over time has been the presence of Havoc. The presence of Havoc and the presence of Demonology losing out over time, week by week. Now Retribution Paladin has started to make more room, more presence in the keys up to this week, where Ret Paladin is definitely above Havoc and Rogue. which was also a pretty decent presence when it comes to melee options, which is now being taken up by Red Paladin. Funnily enough, after we mentioned the lowering of the presence of Discipline Priest in the meta over Mistweaver, if we keep going according to this is perhaps the most dominant we have seen Discipline in the most popular runs compared to the previous weeks, where it was perhaps more split across other options. Now the results only show 3 different picks other than Discipline Priest. Same goes for tanks. Now protection is on life support in the options. Before there was 1, the week before that there were 2, the week before that there were still 2, the one after that there were 5 even, and now we are down to just 1 protection paladin. We will see by the end of next week if they will have been completely extinguished from the top compositions of keys in Mythic Plus. But with this one being out of the way, we can now close the video with what has been basically the news of the week, which has been the beginning of the time trials for the MDI tournament, which might or might not further push some players into trying some of these specs being highlighted. We might even see, perhaps even check Druid, since we have pointed out how Resto Druid has been also losing popularity over time to Mistweaver. We might keep checking it out just to see if Resto Druid will start popping up a bit more in the presence in Mythic Plus, purely based on the use that is being done in the MDI tournament, together with Destruction as well as Shadow Priest. So for now, on this Tuesday, this has been our weekly update when it comes to Mythic Plus. I am now going to leave you to the rest of your reset day, I guess in NA, and soon to be reset day in EU. With this out of the way, thanks of course as usual to everyone who has been supporting through Patreon, but also everyone who has been doing it completely for free, liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these pointless things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, no, I'm sorry, I am not contractually obligated to have an ending bit every time I'm closing a video. So this time I'm striking.